Hi, this is Gail Sokol. On today's show, we're going to be talking about pie crusts.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
So if you've ever eaten a pie, we all know what we love about the pie. The filling is good, but it's the pie crust. That's what keeps coming back. That's what keeps us coming back, right? Our forkful of that flaky, beautiful, breakable crust that is so delicious and tender. Well, there's a few different types of pie crust, and I think we ought to have a discussion about them. So the first thing I want to discuss is this protein matrix that we define as gluten. Gluten is something that bakers love and hate. It's sort of a mixed bag. So gluten gives us strength and structure. It gives our baked goods strength and structure. And some of the baked goods, we want a lot of strength and structure, like a bagel, like a pizza crust. We want them chewy and to resist our bite when we tear into them. And there are other times when we want less structure, like a pie crust. We want it to break easily. We want it to be flaky and tender. So gluten is really the proteins in wheat flour. And there are two proteins in wheat flour called gliadin and glutenin. And there will not be a test at the end of the show, so don't worry. And if you mix these proteins or this wheat flour, and the proteins are in the wheat flour, if you mix flour with water, gluten develops. And it's known as a protein matrix, like a spider web, and it holds things. It has spaces in between the matrix of protein. It can hold air, and it can hold steam. And this is a very powerful leavening agent, especially when we want to create layers of flakiness for pie crusts. So let's talk about the first type of pie that we love, flaky pie crust. And it's called a flaky pie crust, but the actual name, the official name is pâte brisée, another French term, which means broken crust or broken pastry. It's a very simple thing to make, really. When you think about it, there's only a couple of ingredients, but people have so much trouble with it. And you really don't need to fret if you do certain things. And that is, you want to keep the fat that you use in this particular type of pastry cold. And you want to keep another ingredient, water, cold, ice cold. So the first thing I want to do when I make a flaky pie crust is I get a lot of ice, I add water to it, and I just let it hang out so that water temperature goes down. I don't want to melt my fat. And my fat is usually in the form of butter because butter tastes so good. But you can use other forms of fat. A lot of people use lard, which is fat rendered from hogs. You can also use different types of fats that are vegetable shortenings. And a lot of people like those as well. To be honest with you, vegetable shortenings will make a flakier pie crust because they have a higher melting point than butter. The higher the melting point of that fat, the flakier the pie crust will be. So I'll explain that as we go on. But as you make your pie crust, you're going to get one bowl, and this is a one bowl situation. You don't need many bowls or saucepans. You want to put flour into a bowl, and it can be pastry flour. Pastry flour and flour in general can come in different percentages of protein. So you can get a pastry flour that has less protein than something like a bread flour, and you can create less gluten when you mix it with water. If you don't have pastry flour, don't fret. You can actually just use all-purpose flour. And what is all-purpose flour? It's just flour for any purpose. You can make a pizza. You can make a bagel with it. You can even make a pie crust with it. You can make anything with it, and that's what it's for. It's for the home baker that wants to make all different things in their kitchen. So we're going to start with mixing flour and salt, and we're going to use something called a pastry blender. Maybe you have one at home, maybe you don't. You don't necessarily need one, but it's a good tool to have if you're a pie maker. So there's a handle. It's usually wood, can also be metal. And then there's loops of metal. And sometimes they're slightly sharp, and you can roll them into the flour, and you add your butter into that flour and salt, and you cut it in. It's actually, the recipe will say, cut your butter or your fat into the flour. And you will do this sort of rolling, almost like a seesaw motion, like you'll roll your butter in. And you're not going to thoroughly blend it in. You're only going to blend it in until the butter becomes almost pea-sized. Those little green, little tiny itty-bitty vegetables, just pea-sized pieces. And then once you have your flour, salt, and your cold fat blended in by this, you've cut your fat into, because it's almost like cutting. If you don't have a pastry blender, you can use a knife and a fork to literally cut it into the flour and salt. And once it's pea-sized pieces, you put the pastry blender down. Leave it alone. Do not use it again because you don't want the fat to get too mixed in. Next, you're going to take your icy water and you're going to add a small amount of icy water into the flour and the fat. And you're going to blend it until it becomes a ball of dough. You don't want to add too much water. The more water you add, remember what happens when you add wheat flour and water. Gluten forms. And this only happens in wheat flours. So you want to make sure you keep the amount of water down because you really do want less structure and more flakiness and more tenderness. You have to be careful you don't overdo the ice water. Some people, I'm one of them, I like to add a little bit of an acid. And I don't mean like hydrochloric acid. I mean like a little bit of vinegar, apple cider vinegar, orange juice, lemon juice. Some people even add vodka. A little bit, like a tablespoon, depending on how big their dough is, into their dough ingredients. This makes the dough what's known as extensible. It actually breaks down the proteins in that matrix of gluten a little bit so that once you start rolling out the dough with your rolling pin and you want to form that pie, it makes it easier to roll out. So I'm always sure to add a little lemon juice or orange juice or a little bit of apple cider vinegar. I usually don't use vodka and the alcohol will bake right off. But if you don't want to use that, you don't have to. Once you have that flaky pie dough and it actually forms a nice ball of dough, you're going to wrap it in plastic wrap, you're going to flatten it, and you're going to put it in the refrigerator to be chilled. You want that butter to go back to being a little bit harder, and you don't want that butter to melt. Because let's look in the oven. Let's go into the future. We've made our pie crust, we've rolled it out, we've filled it, we've covered it with another layer of pie dough, and we put it in the oven. What's happening in the oven? Well, if you've ever known a pie recipe, it always bakes at a higher temperature, usually about 425 degrees Fahrenheit. That's usually what a fruit pie usually bakes at. So that's a pretty high temperature. So what's happening in the dough, if you go into the dough, become very tiny, microscopic. Shoot yourself into the dough. The butter, the little chunks of those pea-sized pieces of butter, they're going to melt. They're going to seep into the dough and they're going to leave spaces, actual spaces that are going to fill with moisture. And that moisture under high temperature, what's it going to form? Steam. Steam. Oh my goodness. Steam is an incredibly powerful leavener. Bakers love steam. All right. And there's a lot of pastry that is steam leavened. Think puff pastry. That's steam leavened. There's nothing else to make it rise. Well, the same thing with this flaky pie dough. When it's in the oven, all these little pieces of butter are going to melt and form spacers. So the goodness of the butter, that butter fat, that delicious flavor is going to go into the crust, and you're never going to lose that. but then you're going to have water because there's water in the dough and there's also some water in the fat. And that's going to turn to steam. And that's going to push up on the dough layers above and below those pieces of fat where they once were. And that's going to separate those layers. And what do you have? Flakiness. Incredible flakiness. That's why it's called a flaky pie crust. So that's our flaky pie crust. And it's usually used on the bottom of a fruit pie and the top of a fruit pie, usually fruit pies or custard pies. Now, there's a special version of a flaky pie crust or a pâte brisée that I want to talk about, and it's the exact same method of making it, but I'll show you what we do differently. It's called a mealy pie dough, and you never really see a home baker make it, but I'm going to give you a tip that it really, really is a cool thing to make. So it's usually used only as a bottom crust. So if you have something like a pumpkin pie, a custard pie, how do you prevent this wetness? How do you prevent that custard from soaking into the bottom crust? And there's many ways to prevent it, but one way is to make a mealy pie dough. So it's the same exact ingredients. You take your flour and your salt, you mix them together. Then you cut in your cold fat, but this time you cut your cold fat into such tiny pieces, they're almost like cornmeal. They're really fine, super fine. The fat almost coats every particle of flour, and this prevents a lot of gluten from forming. So the crust is tender and water will not go inside it. It is water impermeable, just like the fat on a duck, all right? And a duck's feathers, they can go in cold water and never feel it. So it's very impermeable to water, and this is perfect for a bottom crust. And this is a trick that a lot of professional chefs make. They do when they make these custard pies. So this is a great little tip that I can tell you about. The other way that you can prevent a pastry from being very, very soggy is to put something in between, let's say, the fruit layer or the custard layer and the crust. So you may want to ground up some ginger snaps, for instance. It doesn't have to be homemade ginger snaps. It could just be graham crackers, just little bits of crumb. Make a little layer on the bottom crust before you put your filling in. Those flavors will blend in with the filling. It will keep your bottom crust dry. So that's a nice little tip. You can use little sponge cake crumbs. You can use cookie crumbs, anything you want that way. The next type of pie crust that I want to talk about is called a pâte sucrée. That is also a French term for sugar cookie crust. And again, it is exactly what I just said. It's basically a sugar cookie crust. It usually contains more sugar and fat. It usually contains egg yolks and sometimes even a whole egg, but usually the yolk, because of the fat, the quality of the fat is just so fabulous in that egg yolk. It adds incredible richness. Plus, the fat is softened. It's actually brought to room temperature, so none of this cold fat. So when you make a pâte sucrée or a sugar cookie crust, I usually make it in the food processor or in the electric mixer. And you just blend the softened butter and sugar and the egg yolks and maybe even a little baking powder, maybe no baking powder. It depends on the recipe. And sometimes it can even have cream in it, a couple tablespoons of cream to enrich it. Once it's created and once you've made this dough, it almost looks like a batter. It's very sort of moist, and there's no way you could roll it out into a crust. At this point, I scoop it out of my food processor or my electric mixer, put it on plastic wrap, cover it in the plastic wrap, and flatten it to a disc, like a 1-inch thick disc, and I refrigerate it or freeze it until it gets nice and firm. At this point, I can make a fruit tart with this. So this is a tart that instead of the entire pie getting baked at once, like an apple pie with our flaky pie crusts, our pumpkin pie or our custard pie, usually you put the fruit in, you put the whole thing, the crust, the filling bakes all at the same time. This is different. So this sugar cookie crust, you bake the crust blind. And it doesn't mean that you are blindfolded and turned around a few times and you don't know where the oven is. It's basically where you put some parchment paper in the bottom crust with some beans or pie weights. Maybe you've seen them sold in various cooking stores or kitchen stores. And they hold the pastry down so it doesn't bubble up. And you bake it without any filling in it whatsoever. And then you slowly take out your parchment paper filled with your beans. Sometimes I use uncooked beans. And then you brown it a little bit more in the oven. And there you have this little fully cooked pie shell. And this I can fill with things like a vanilla custard or a pastry cream and top it with sliced fruit and make a beautiful fruit tart. So that is spectacular. So that is a sugar cookie crust. The last type of dough that we want to make is a pâte sablée. This is known as sandy dough because sablé means sand in French. And this has even more softened butter, as if we needed more butter, and even more sugar. And it is so much sugar in it, it actually is sandy in feel. Actually feels sandy. And it really can't be rolled out. It just breaks apart too much. There's almost no gluten development in it, and it really breaks apart. So sometimes when I use this, I have to pat it into the bottom of the pan. And I love to use this in a false bottom tart pan. That's a pan where the bottom comes out. So it actually, you can push up from the bottom and the bottom will separate from the sides. And it's fluted and very pretty on the sides of the pan. And you always want to bake this type of a tart or a pie. It's a little more fancy. You usually want to put this type of a pie, or really any type of pie before it goes into the oven, on a sheet pan, because you don't want to destroy the sides of your pie crust. A lot of people make that mistake. They'll put it in the oven and they'll grab it with their oven mitts and the whole thing is destroyed. Or the bottom falls out if it's a false bottom tart pan. So you don't want to do that. So the one thing you can do with a pâte sablée or sandy dough is bake what's known as a Linzer tort or a Linzer tart. And it's not really a tort, which implies a cake. It's actually a tart, a fancy tart that is made in a false bottom tart pan with fluted sides. And it has raspberry jam on the inside and a lattice-topped crust on the top, all made from this pâte sablée dough. And it is amazing. So today we've learned a lot about all different pie crusts. And if you have any questions about pie crusts, head to bakingradio.com. And if you want to leave me a message, I'd love to answer some of your questions on air. Next week, we're actually going to be baking the perfect apple pie.